So this is a kind of maverick Israeli conservative politician called Naftali Bennett. I've heard of him before, and how he's maybe operating a little bit outside of the kind of status quo on the Israeli right. And he's proposing, well, they're talking about an article he wrote, where he's proposing to actually annex the Area C in the West Bank, and offer the Palestinians living there, full Israeli citizenship, which means, access to services and all those kinds of things. One would presume that it would not mean equal rights regarding to land, and the other things that are baked into the Israeli state. And thus, I think that he's presenting things in somewhat of a tinted manner. Maybe he's presenting things as rosier than they are or are likely to be. But I do think that he's arrived at a fundamental understanding that is rare to see, and that's that the answer has to be integration, not separation. If you want peace, if you want stability, then you need the Israelis and Jews to integrate with each other. Not walls, not separation, not splitting off into different countries, but integration. And the host is saying, well, they don't want to, they don't want to. And he's saying, well, I disagree. I think they do want to. And I agree with this Israeli conservative guy that they do want to. I mean, the average Palestinian isn't going to be different than anybody else. They want, they care about their family, they care about their jobs, and these lofty concepts of ethnic-based nationalism are not really that important to most people. They are going to be more important, no doubt, to somebody sitting in a nice office on the other side of the world who is analyzing things abstractly, who doesn't have to worry about where they're going to get something to eat, than they are to people that are actually dealing with some pretty heavy shit in the ground, right? And it's more to the extent that the ethnic nationalism is a real thing. It's a consequence of the economic uncertainty, rather than an addendum to it, right? That's the fundamental difference. Is that it seems pretty real when you're starving and those guys over there aren't, and all the guys that aren't starving, wear one thing on their heads, and all the people that are starving wear something else on their heads, right? Then it's easy to see that there's a correlation between whether you're starving or not and what it is that you wear on your head. But if you can address those economic issues, then you would expect the rest of it to fall apart, for most people that aren't analysts in nice, cozy offices in Washington, where you're basically mentally masturbating over something that you have no real actual connection to, right? The the Where'd that word go? I've still got a headache. It's the ivory tower. The ivory tower, anyways, is the idea I'm trying to get across. So I agree with this guy, and like I say, you might not be presenting things entirely accurately, like in terms of broad scope issues, and exactly what he's saying might be, mildly insane. But the basic idea of integration, as a necessity, um, is a real, necessary pivot that everybody on both sides, on all three sides, the third side being Washington, needs to recognize, and try to work more towards. And if what that means is unilateral annexation, then I think that's a positive step forward. Um, I mean, nobody's getting anywhere by setting up this independent Palestinian state. These Swiss cheese territories, um, where their entire economy is completely dependent on the Israelis. I mean, the best that an independent Palestinian state could ever be would be basically a puppet state. It would be so reliant. It's an impossibility, right? So they need to look at integration. And I mean, I can understand, if you've spent your whole life, you know, I mean, if you were 20 years old in 1947, so let's say you were 20 in 1950, well then you're in your 80s now, and you've spent 60 years, 65 years, um, eh, with the expectation that there's going to be two states here, right? It's just always been what is. Um, and whether 60 years is a long time, 30 years is a long time, right? So you're talking about generations of people, but these are generations that are moving out of the public sphere, and one has to hope that with this generational overturn and with some younger people taking over, that this kind of mindset of separating into different countries over no good reason is kind of discarded, and an integrationist approach is picked up upon, because that's the only future in the region. I talked about this before. You know, any way that you look at it, there is no future besides accepting that there's a very large population of Arabs here, and that they need to be integrated and work into a secular society. There needs to be a lot of attention to their living standards. And it just does not make sense to separate them out to a different country based on what God, or it's the same God. Well, it's based on what they wear on their heads, or you know uh, what tint of tan your skin is. It's stupid. The whole premise is stupid, and I really hope that what this guy is presenting is an awareness um, that it is stupid, and that this is becoming, especially with the younger people, that people are kind of maybe getting out of the old mindset and maybe adopting something that's more realistic, and frankly more liberal, regarding how people interact with each other. Um, that said, that can't work either unless there are a lot of reforms within Israel regarding what kind of rights people have towards land, what kind of rights people um, well, I think the land is the big thing. But I mean, they need to look at the way they teach their textbooks, and like the whole culture, right? It's ridiculous, right? If you look into it, you'll see that it's really quite outrageous. Um, and that's going to go with a broader secularization. You know, the Israeli state really needs to be focusing less on getting all of these ultra orthodox people out, and building these these societies full of like violently religious Jewish people, um, and instead kind of finding ways to get people to integrate with each other, so that you have communities that are part Jewish, part Orthodox, part secular, part Arab, part Muslim, part Christian. Um, like people that are all mixed up, rather than having these segregated societies, right? Um, and it's once you get that jumble up, that everybody lives happily in in harmony and all that kind of stuff, right? Um, so yeah, I think this guy and the moderators talking about like this is insane. Nobody in the political spectrum is going to go for this. Right now, that might be true, but one has to hope that as we have this generational overturn, and I understand this might be something that older people just might not get because their whole lives it's what it's been all about. But if this whole conflict disappears as the generation overturns, um, I think in the long run, what this guy's saying could be um, seen as mildly visionary, um, because it is really, honestly, the only way forward. It's more a question of how can this be done fairly, so that everybody has their rights protected, kind of thing. Um, and yeah, that's going to. I mean, you can't. This is one example of how much of a change in mindset this needs to be. You can't talk about annexing these areas of the West Bank unless you acknowledge a right of return. Those ideas are just intrinsically intertwined, right? Now, this guy might not agree with that, but at least, like I say, coming to the epiphany that the future is integration um, is a step in coming to that understanding, right? So, I mean, maybe from an unlikely place in the political spectrum, and maybe with unlikely methods, um, but that recognition of integration is really refreshing. I don't think I've ever seen um, an Israeli politician talk in those terms in ways that don't seem um, ironic or pandering. I'm going to cut some more cheese up and get back to finishing my little snack here before I get back to archiving.